We picture ancient humans as primitive, grunting cave monsters. We assume they abandoned their dead like mindless animals. It is easy to assume this survival-driven reality left no room for grief. Which raises a question that's a lot more loaded and a lot more scientifically interesting than it first appears. Were our ancestors actually devoid of emotion when facing death? Or have we completely misunderstood the concept of mourning throughout human history? Let's untangle this properly, because the honest answer requires separating two genuinely different concepts that get mashed together. Spoiler, the answer to that question is an emphatic yes. And it's the key to understanding basically everything else in this entire complex topic. Let's start with the very concept of intentionality, because differentiating between simple utilitarian corpse disposal and a genuinely meaningful burial practice requires looking closely at the forensic evidence. When early hominins lived in enclosed spaces, removing a deceased body was often just a matter of basic hygiene, a biological necessity to avoid attracting scavengers or spreading infection. So, how do archaeologists actually prove that a group of ancient humans was doing something deliberately ceremonial rather than just taking out the trash? This brings us to a genuinely fascinating archaeological site in Spain, called Atapuerca. Specifically, a deep cave shaft known as Cima de los Huesos, or the Pit of Bones. Down in this incredibly isolated shaft, scientists discovered over 6,000 bone fragments, belonging to 28 distinct individuals who lived approximately 430,000 years ago. Now, what makes this specific collection of remains so enormously significant is what is entirely missing from the bones themselves. There are absolutely no tooth marks from large terrestrial predators anywhere. These individuals were not dragged into this cave by carnivores, nor did they simply fall in by accident while exploring. The physical evidence strongly suggests their bodies were intentionally carried and deliberately dropped down into this specific pit by their surviving peers. But here is where the behavioral analysis shifts from mere corpse disposal to something that looks remarkably like an early ritual. Mixed in among those thousands of ancestral bones, researchers found a single, beautifully crafted pink quartz hand axe. This specific artifact, often affectionately referred to as Excalibur, shows absolutely no microscopic signs of ever being used for practical, everyday tasks like butchering meat or cutting heavy wood. The presence of a pristine, visually striking tool placed alongside the dead strongly indicates it was a deliberate symbolic offering. It represents a monumental cognitive leap, suggesting these ancient ancestors of Neanderthals possessed a nascent understanding of mourning, honoring their deceased with an object of pure, non-functional value. Now, let's bring up something genuinely fascinating regarding the Neanderthals specifically, because this is where our understanding gets considerably more nuanced than a simple assumption of emotional superiority. For generations, the standard cultural narrative has overwhelmingly painted Neanderthals as fundamentally lacking the emotional depth required for genuine grief, reducing them to a crude, grunting cave monster stereotype. However, analyzing the archaeological record reveals an entirely separate, additional layer of emotional complexity that challenges everything we previously thought we knew about their capacity for pure compassion. Deep within the Shanidar Cave in northern Iraq, researchers uncovered the preserved remains of a Neanderthal male, designated as Shanidar IV, who lived between 60,000 and 75,000 years ago. What makes this specific burial matter enormously in conversations focused purely on ancient emotional intelligence is what intimately surrounded the physical body. Soil analysis revealed heavily concentrated clusters of pollen belonging to specific plant species widely known for their distinct medicinal properties, including yarrow and cornflower. For decades, this discovery sparked a genuinely intense debate within the scientific community. Skeptics logically argued that these microscopic pollen grains could have easily been tracked into the cave by burrowing rodents or simply carried on the wind, effectively dismissing the romantic notion of a deliberate floral tribute. It is a completely fair, highly objective scientific critique. But recent, highly sophisticated excavations conducted at the exact same site, focusing on a newly analyzed individual, known as Shanidar Z, have provided the robust, visible evidence that dramatically shifts the entire analytical paradigm. These modern analyses strongly reinforce the original interpretation of an intentional, deeply careful placement. The deceased individual was not simply discarded to the harsh elements. They were deliberately positioned within a natural gully, and remarkably, their head was carefully rested upon a chosen stone serving as a crude but undeniable supportive pillow. This physical positioning requires a level of tender, deliberate handling that goes far beyond basic, utilitarian corpse disposal practices. When we purposefully combine this deliberate physical arrangement with the specific presence of medicinal pollen, a profoundly different historical picture emerges directly into focus. It suggests a distinct population facing significant physical hardship, responding to overwhelming loss not with cold biological indifference, but with a deliberate attempt to visibly comfort the dead using the very biological materials they likely utilized to physically heal the living. Placing healing flowers alongside a fallen companion is an act of pure, recognizable interpersonal empathy. It conclusively proves that the psychological capacity for profound sorrow and the fundamental desire to actively honor those who have physically passed did not suddenly arrive with modern humans, but existed long before us in the hands of a closely related species we have historically misunderstood. But here's the genuinely important wrinkle worth sitting with directly. When we examine the specific burial practices of early Homo sapiens, we observe a fundamental cognitive shift that goes far beyond mere emotional grief. It represents an enormously significant transition from simply mourning a physical loss to actively preparing the deceased for an entirely separate, unseen existence. This brings us to a genuinely fascinating archaeological site located in Israel known as the Shanidar Cave, dating back roughly 90,000 to 100,000 years into our past. Here, researchers discovered the carefully buried remains of a young child, formerly designated as Shanidar 11, which provided scientists with something completely unprecedented. Resting deliberately on the upper chest of this young individual was a remarkably large deer antler. Furthermore, the immediate surrounding soil was intentionally scattered with significant quantities of a vibrant, naturally occurring powder known as red ochre. This vivid pigment required tremendous communal effort to gather and carefully process before burial. Now, to understand why this matters enormously to evolutionary anthropology, we have to deeply analyze the pure, functional utility of these specific items. A deer antler buried deep underground cannot be utilized as a hunting tool. Crushed red ochre cannot be consumed for vital nutritional value or provide any physical warmth. In the harsh, strictly survival-driven reality of the ancient natural world, expending precious physical energy to acquire and then deliberately bury these entirely non-functional objects alongside a deceased child makes absolutely no practical sense whatsoever, unless of course their fundamental intended purpose was never inherently practical. This specific behavioral pattern represents a massive, virtually unparalleled cognitive leap in human history. It is the undeniable physical footprint of abstract, symbolic thought processes manifesting directly into physical reality. Placing materially useless but visually striking items into a dark grave strongly indicates that these early humans were no longer viewing death as a strict, final biological termination point. Instead, they were beginning to view it as a profound transitional phase. They were clearly conceptualizing an entirely separate dimension of human existence, a conceptual afterlife where these specific symbolic objects would somehow inexplicably retain their inherent meaning and value. It is a genuinely moving realization because it directly mirrors the exact same foundational cognitive architecture that eventually built every single modern religious and spiritual belief system existing across our entire planet today. The deliberate act of surrendering valuable, tangible effort to the cold earth demonstrates a population actively expanding its mental horizons beyond the immediate physical environment. They were reaching directly into a totally abstract conceptual realm, relying entirely on the profoundly powerful, unspoken internal belief that our shared human connection somehow miraculously transcends the absolute finality of our biological mortality forever. Let's also bring up a specific case study that completely expands our understanding of this emotional architecture, extending it far beyond the strict boundaries of our own species. If you currently share your life with a dog, this particular archaeological discovery will likely feel profoundly recognizable. At a remarkable site known as Ain Malaha, associated with the ancient Natufian culture approximately 12,000 years ago, researchers uncovered something genuinely unprecedented in the historical record. They discovered the carefully prepared grave of an elderly individual, but this person was not buried alone. Resting quietly beside them was the skeleton of a young puppy. What makes this burial matter enormously is not just the physical proximity of the two skeletons, but the specific, undeniable tenderness of their physical arrangement. The elderly individual's hand was deliberately positioned so that it rested gently against the puppy's body. This is an entirely separate, genuinely important wrinkle worth sitting with directly. In a harsh, physically demanding ancient environment where every single caloric expenditure mattered for basic survival, choosing to carefully enter an animal that provided no immediate agricultural or protective value speaks volumes about the sophisticated emotional intelligence of these early populations. It strongly suggests that the profound psychological comfort we derive from our modern pets is not some recent cultural invention, but a deeply ingrained biological reality rooted in thousands of years of shared evolutionary history. The genuine grief experienced over the loss of an animal companion was clearly validated and deliberately honored by the broader community. It proves that the human capacity for pure compassion, our fundamental need to maintain a loving connection even in the face of absolute biological termination, had already evolved to cross the boundaries of our own species, recognizing a shared emotional existence with the entire natural world around us. Ultimately, our ancient ancestors were far from the cold and unfeeling machines we often imagine. The archaeological record clearly demonstrates that the fundamental capacity to experience profound grief and the desperate, beautiful urge to somehow physically comfort the dead are not modern inventions. They are deeply embedded biological realities that essentially define our shared humanity. When we look at these ancient burial sites, we are not just looking at discarded bones, we are witnessing the very genesis of love transcending mortality. It is a continuous, unbroken thread of genuine emotional resonance, stretching across hundreds of thousands of years, all the way back to whichever ancient person first gently scattered healing flowers over a fallen companion, or carefully painted the cold, dark earth with vibrant red ochre, and fundamentally decided that the biological end of a physical life did not have to mean the absolute end of their enduring emotional connection.